A few years ago, a team of researchers flew to a small peninsula on the Pacific coast of Costa Rica. They were not there for the beaches. They were not there for the food. They were there because people in this region were dying at a rate that didn't make scientific sense. Not dying too fast, dying too slow. Men and women in their 90s, still working farms with their hands. People celebrating their 100th birthday with full memory, full mobility, and no medications on the nightstand. The scientists needed to understand why. So they drew blood. And what they found inside those veins turned several mainstream assumptions about aging completely upside down. My name is Dr. Marcus Alves, and I have spent the last 18 years studying longevity medicine, chronic inflammation, and the biological markers that separate people who simply get old from people who age with power and clarity. What I am going to share with you today is not a supplement pitch. It is not a protocol I am selling. It is the raw science from one of the most rigorously studied longevity populations on Earth, and it has direct, practical implications for every single person watching right now. Before we go any further, if you are someone who wants to understand the biology of aging rather than just feel its effects, please subscribe to this channel, like this video, and activate the notification bell so you never miss what we cover here. What gets discussed in this space is genuinely different from what you will find anywhere else, and I want to make sure it finds you every time we publish. Now, let me tell you where Nicoya actually is and why the scientific community started paying such close attention to it. The Nicoya Peninsula sits in the Guanacaste province of Costa Rica, stretching along the Pacific coast. In 2005, demographer Michel Poulain and longevity researcher Dan Buettner formally identified it as one of only 5 places on Earth where people consistently live past 100 in exceptional health. They named these regions Blue Zones. Nicoya was placed alongside Okinawa in Japan, Sardinia in Italy, Icaria in Greece, and a community of Seventh-day Adventists in Loma Linda, California. 5 places out of nearly 200 countries, and Nicoya is the only one in all of Latin America. But here is what most coverage of this topic misses entirely, and it is the part that matters most to us as clinicians and scientists. When researchers began drawing actual blood samples from elderly Nicoyans, individuals between 80 and 104 years of age, and comparing those samples to age-matched individuals from other regions of Costa Rica and from North American reference populations, the differences were not small or nuanced. They were stark and consistent, and they pointed to something very specific happening at the cellular level. Something that had nothing to do with inherited genetics and everything to do with the conditions in which these people were living. These individuals were not genetically superior. Studies confirmed that Nicoyans share their genetic heritage with other Central American and indigenous Mesoamerican populations. What was different was not what was written in their DNA. What was different was how that DNA was behaving, how it was being read, maintained, and protected across a lifetime. Let me explain what the researchers actually measured, because this is where the story stops being inspiring and starts being precise. In 2013, a study published in the journal Experimental Gerontology by researchers from the University of Costa Rica and the University of California examined telomere length in elderly Nicoyans. Telomeres are the protective caps on the ends of your chromosomes. The best analogy I can give you is this. Imagine the plastic tip on the end of a shoelace. That tip is the only thing keeping the shoelace from unraveling. Telomeres serve that function for your chromosomes. Every time your cells divide, those caps shorten slightly. When they shorten past a critical threshold, the cell can no longer divide properly. It enters a state called senescence, stops functioning correctly, or it dies. Telomere shortening is one of the most rigorously validated biological clocks in all of aging science. It is measurable, it is reproducible, and it is responsive to the conditions of your life. The Nicoyan men in this study, particularly those between 60 and 70 years of age, showed significantly longer telomeres than age-matched men from the Central Valley of Costa Rica, which is the country's urban and economic center. The difference was not marginal. The researchers estimated that the telomere advantage they measured translated to roughly a decade of slower biological aging. A 65-year-old man from Nicoya was, by this measure, or aging at the cellular pace of a 55-year-old from the capital city. And if that number lands for you, if you feel the weight of what it means to be biologically 10 years younger than your calendar age at 65, then the question that should immediately follow is the only one worth asking. Why? What was actually happening in these bodies that was not happening in the comparison populations? When the researchers laid the lifestyle and environmental data on top of the blood data, 3 signals rose to the surface consistently, and all 3 of them are things that can be understood, acted upon, and in many cases replicated. The first signal was water, specifically the calcium and magnesium concentrations in Nicoya's local drinking water. A Nicoya sits on a geological substrate that naturally mineralizes its groundwater over centuries of contact with mineral-rich limestone and volcanic rock. The water there has some of the highest naturally occurring calcium and magnesium content measured in any drinking water supply in the Americas. Researchers from the Pan American Health Organization documented this geological reality years before the longevity research began. But it was only when the blood data was layered on top of the water quality data that the significance crystallized. Here is the part that most people have never been told, and it is the part I want you to sit with for a moment. Magnesium is involved in over 300 enzymatic reactions in the human body. It plays roles in energy production, protein synthesis, nerve function, and blood sugar regulation. But in the context of longevity specifically, there is one function of magnesium that rises above the rest. Magnesium is required for the proper activation of telomerase, the enzyme whose specific job is to repair and maintain telomere length. Without adequate magnesium in the body, telomerase cannot function at normal efficiency. The machinery that is supposed to protect your cellular clock simply does not run properly. Telomeres shorten faster, cells age faster. And what did the Nicoyans have in extraordinary daily effortless abundance? Not from supplements, not from a protocol someone prescribed to them, but simply from drinking the water that came out of their land. Magnesium. The researchers also documented that the elevated calcium levels in the drinking water correlated strongly with significantly lower rates of cardiovascular mortality in the region, which is consistent with decades of epidemiological literature linking hard water, water high in dissolved minerals, to reduced cardiac death. This is not a new finding in the general literature. What was new was seeing it demonstrated so vividly in a population that was also showing biological aging markers decades ahead of their chronological age. If you are still with me, and this is beginning to change how you think about something as basic and overlooked as what is in your water, please take a second right now to hit the like button and make sure you are subscribed with the notification bell activated. What we are covering today is the kind of content that takes serious research to produce, and even more serious thinking to apply. Your engagement with this channel is what makes it possible to keep going. The second signal that emerged from the blood data was something the inflammatory markers revealed, or rather what they failed to reveal, which was the remarkable and consistent absence of chronic low-grade inflammation in the elderly Nicoyan population. Chronic low-grade inflammation is now the most broadly accepted underlying mechanism connecting aging to disease. Not just one disease, most of them. Cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia, certain cancers, autoimmune conditions, the sustained, the smoldering inflammatory state that accelerates cellular damage across multiple organ systems has been given its own name in the scientific literature. Inflammaging. It is a combination of the words inflammation and aging, because the two have become so inseparable in the research that treating them as distinct phenomena has become scientifically untenable. Inflammaging is measurable in the blood through markers like C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, and tumor necrosis factor alpha. These are standard panels. Any physician can order them. In elderly Nicoyans, these inflammatory markers were substantially and consistently lower than in comparison populations of the same age. And when the researchers looked at why, the dietary pattern was impossible to dismiss. The traditional Nicoyan diet is built on 3 foods that have formed the foundation of eating in this region for centuries. Black beans, corn masa tortillas made through the process of nixtamalization, and squash. That is the base. Everything else, fish, tropical fruit, eggs, is supplementary. What makes this dietary foundation so biologically relevant is what it delivers at the molecular level, day after day, meal after meal. Black beans are among the highest fiber foods ever measured in the nutritional literature. And fiber, specifically the fermentable soluble fiber found in legumes, feeds the gut microbiome, which regulates systemic inflammation through the production of short-chain fatty acids. This is not a fringe theory, and this is one of the most active areas of peer-reviewed research in gastroenterology and immunology right now. A healthy, fiber-fed microbiome produces butyrate and other short-chain fatty acids that directly suppress inflammatory signaling pathways throughout the body. A microbiome starved of fermentable fiber, as is the case in most modern Western diets, produces elevated inflammatory signals instead. The traditional nixtamalized corn used in Nicoyan tortillas adds a layer of biological advantage that most people have never heard of. Nixtamalization is an ancient Mesoamerican process in which corn is cooked and soaked in an alkaline solution made from lime. This process does something remarkable to the corn. It increases the bioavailability of niacin, vitamin B3, which in unprocessed corn is chemically bound in a form the human body cannot absorb. It increases the calcium content. It makes the amino acid profile more complete, and it contributes to a lower glycemic response compared to non-nixtamalized corn products. This process was developed thousands of years ago without any knowledge of biochemistry, yet it optimized the staple food of an entire civilization in ways that modern food science is still working to fully document. The squash adds beta-carotene, which the body converts to vitamin A, along with additional anti-inflammatory carotenoid compounds. It is fiber, micronutrients, and antioxidant activity in every bite. The researchers noted something that should make every one of us pause. The oldest and most biologically healthy Nicoyans were not the ones who had adopted modern foods as their economic circumstances improved. They were consistently the ones who had not. The people in these villages who continued eating the traditional diet showed the most favorable inflammatory profiles by a substantial margin. The people in the same villages, and sometimes in the same families, who had shifted toward processed foods, refined carbohydrates, and packaged products, showed inflammatory markers trending sharply upward toward the profiles of aging populations in North America and urban Latin America. Modernity had arrived, and where it replaced the old foods, the biological advantages began to disappear. The third signal in the blood was the one that most surprised the researchers, and it brings us to a variable that medicine has historically been reluctant to take seriously because it resists being put in a pill. In populations where people routinely live past 100, there is almost always a psychological and social variable present that is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore once you start looking. In Nicoya, researchers from the University of Costa Rica identified it through their qualitative interviews with centenarians across the peninsula. They named it with a phrase from the culture itself, plan de vida. It translates roughly as reason to live or life plan. It is the felt sense of being needed, of having a purpose that extends beyond your own comfort and survival, of waking up in the morning knowing that something or someone requires your presence. The biology behind this is entirely real and is well established in the psychoneuroimmunology literature. Chronic psychological stress, the persistent, unresolved kind, activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and floods the body with cortisol. Sustained elevated cortisol is directly toxic to telomeres. It accelerates their shortening. It suppresses immune function. It elevates the same inflammatory markers we discussed a moment ago. Chronic stress does not just feel bad. It ages you at the molecular level in ways that show up in a blood panel years later. The centenarians in Nicoya showed blood cortisol profiles that were measurably and consistently lower than urban comparison groups of the same age. And when researchers asked them about stress, about worry, about fear, and about how they related to the difficulties of a long life, the answers were remarkably consistent across individuals who had never met each other and lived in different parts of the peninsula. These were not people who had lived easy lives. They had lost children. They had worked without relief from a very young age. They had known hunger and hardship. But they had a framework for difficulty. They had deep community ties. They had daily physical purpose, not exercise scheduled into a calendar, but labor that was inseparable from the life they were living. And they had, in almost every case, a clear and felt sense that the people around them needed them to continue. The researchers concluded that the psychological protection of Plan de Vida was translating into measurable biological protection through the cortisol axis. Purpose is not a philosophical luxury for people who have already taken care of everything else. It is a biological input that changes what happens inside your cells. It shows up in your blood. So what does all of this mean for someone watching this who does not live in Nicoya, does not drink naturally mineralized groundwater, and is not embedded in the kind of multi-generational community where purpose is not something you have to search for? It means that aging well is not a genetic lottery. It is a set of biological targets, 3 of them clearly identified, that respond to behavior and environment: telomere maintenance, systemic inflammation, and the cortisol stress axis. All 3 can be shifted in measurable directions within months, not decades. For the magnesium pathway, the data is unambiguous. Dietary magnesium is significantly underconsumed across Western populations. The average adult in the United States consumes less than 260 milligrams daily. The recommended dietary allowance sits between 300 and 420 milligrams, depending on age and sex. That gap translates into impaired telomerase function, accelerated cellular aging, and elevated cardiovascular risk. The foods highest in bioavailable magnesium are dark leafy greens, pumpkin seeds, legumes including black beans, and dark chocolate above 70% cacao. These are not specialty foods. They are accessible at any grocery store. Closing that magnesium gap is one of the most straightforward and evidence-supported moves a person can make for their cellular age. For the inflammation pathway, the lesson from Nicoya's dietary data is this: fiber is not a supplement category. It is a foundational daily requirement for the microbiome that regulates your inflammatory baseline. Every meal is either contributing to or eroding that baseline. Increasing daily legume consumption, reducing ultra-processed food intake, and returning fiber to the center of the plate are the mechanical changes that shift C-reactive protein and interleukin-6 in the right direction. This is not novel. It is consistent across virtually every longevity population ever studied. For the cortisol and purpose axis, this one resists being reduced to a to-do list, and that is precisely why it tends to get left out of these conversations. But the research is consistent across Nicoya and every other blue zone studied. Felt social connection and a sense of daily purpose are not soft quality-of-life variables. They are hard biological variables that determine inflammatory load and telomere maintenance over decades. Daily physical contact with people who matter to you, activity that carries meaning beyond personal gain, and the simple felt sense of being missed if you were not there. These are the conditions under which cortisol stays low, telomeres stay long, and centenarians happen. The question worth sitting with is not philosophical. It is medical. What in your daily life gives you the feeling of being genuinely needed? The researchers who flew to that peninsula and drew blood from people with a century of living behind them were looking for the secret. What they found was that the secret had been hiding in plain sight for generations, and embedded in the mineral composition of ancient water, in a dietary pattern that modern food science is only now learning to respect, and in a psychological orientation toward life that produces measurable, protective, biological effects. This is not sentiment dressed up as science. This is science with a blood panel behind it, published in peer-reviewed journals, replicated across populations, and pointing toward conclusions that are as practical as they are profound. If you are watching this right now and found something in it worth carrying forward, please subscribe to this channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell so you are here for everything we cover going forward. This is research that deserves to reach more people, and every single one of you who stays connected to this channel makes that possible.